do this? I know I made a mistake, but you can't just throw everything away.
I still remember the way my hands trembled as I adjusted my tie and stared at my reflection. Today is the day, I whispered to myself. Don't mess this up. My phone rang, and I smiled when I saw Emily's name. Hey, bride-to-be, I said. There was silence for a second. Then she said, we need to cancel the wedding. I laughed nervously. Very funny. You almost got me. I'm not joking, she replied. Her voice sounded cold, like I was talking to a stranger. Emily, what do you mean? I asked. I mean we can't get married, she said. I'm sorry. I felt my throat go dry. Sorry for what? For the venue? For the flowers? We can fix anything. It's not about the wedding, she said quietly. It's about us. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. Just say it clearly, I told her. Don't talk in circles. She took a deep breath and said, I met someone else. My heart started pounding. You met someone, and now you're canceling our wedding. I asked, who is he? She hesitated, then said, his name is Daniel. I repeated the name slowly. Daniel, I said. And what does Daniel have that I don't? She didn't answer right away. Then she said the words that broke me. He can give me a better life. I laughed, but it didn't sound like me. A better life. Emily, we were building a life together. I know, she said. But this is different. Different how? I asked. Is he richer? She stayed silent. So he is, I said. Is that all it took? It's not just money, she said. It's security, connections, opportunities. I felt anger rising in my chest. So I was just a temporary plan. I asked. No, she said quickly. You were never temporary. But I'm not permanent either, I replied. She started crying softly. Please don't make this harder, she said. Harder? I repeated. You're canceling our wedding and asking me not to make it hard. She whispered. I didn't plan for this to happen. But it did, I said. So what now? You marry him instead. She didn't respond. That silence was the answer. I slid down to the floor and stared at nothing. How long? I asked quietly. How long have you known him? A few months, she said. A few months, I repeated. And that was enough to throw us away. I didn't throw you away, she said. It feels like you did, I replied. Look me in the eye and tell me you love him. She didn't speak. Emily, tell me, I said again. She finally said, I don't know what I feel. I nodded slowly even though she couldn't see me. But you know what you feel about me, I said. She started crying again. I'm sorry, she repeated. Stop saying sorry, I said. It doesn't fix anything. I never wanted to hurt you, she said. But you did, I replied. You really did. There was a long silence between us. Then I asked, if he didn't exist, would you still marry me? She whispered, I don't know. That answer hurt more than anything else. I swallowed and said, then I guess this is goodbye. Please don't disappear, she said quickly. Can we at least talk in person? I looked at my reflection in the mirror again. I barely recognized the man staring back at me. There's nothing left to say, I told her. There's everything to say, she replied. We had years together. And you ended them with one phone call, I said. She kept crying, but I felt strangely calm. Emily, I said, I hope he gives you the life you want. I didn't want to lose you, she said. But you chose to, I replied. She whispered my name, but I pulled the phone away from my ear. Goodbye, Emily, I said, and I ended the call. I kept staring at the mirror for a long time and said quietly, today was the day after all. Just not the day I expected. I sank onto the chair and said, what am I supposed to do now? I asked the empty room. My voice sounded strange. You were going to be a husband today, I told myself. Now you're just a man in a suit with nowhere to go. My phone buzzed again, and I saw her name, but I didn't answer. No, I said, shaking my head. You don't get to change your mind twice in one day. The phone kept ringing, and I finally whispered, I loved you, Emily. I really did. I hope one day you understand what you threw away, I said to the silent room, because I don't think I ever will. I whispered softly. I sat across from Mark and stared at the glass in my hand. Say it, I told him. Say whatever you've been holding back. Mark sighed and said, You ignored the signs. I shook my head. No, I trusted the woman I was going to marry. He leaned forward. She was pulling away for months. I took a slow breath. She said she was busy with work. Mark gave me a tired look. Late-night texts, cancelled dinners, sudden trips. That's not just work. I gripped my glass tighter. Why didn't you tell me? He shrugged. I tried. You didn't want to hear it. I looked down. I thought love meant trust. Love also means paying attention, he said. I laughed bitterly. So this is my fault now. I didn't say that, Mark replied. She made her choice. But you refused to see what was happening. I stayed quiet for a moment, then asked, Who is he really? Mark hesitated. His name is Daniel. He's rich, connected, and used to getting what he wants. I felt my jaw tighten. So she upgraded. Don't say that, Mark said. It's the truth, I replied. I was the safe choice. He's the powerful choice. Mark didn't argue. That silence said enough. I rubbed my face and said, Did she plan this? Mark took a sip of his drink. I don't think it was one moment. I think it was a slow decision. So while I was planning a wedding, she was planning a way out, I said quietly. Mark looked at me and said, She didn't choose him overnight. I closed my eyes when I heard that. That sentence just destroyed whatever was left of me, I said. I'm sorry, Mark replied. I shook my head. No, I need to hear this. I need the truth, even if it hurts. He nodded slowly. People don't leave suddenly. They leave in small steps. I repeated his words quietly. Small steps, I said. And I didn't see any of them. You saw them, he said. You just explained them away. I laughed without humor. Yeah, I did. I looked at him and asked, Tell me honestly. Was I not enough? Mark immediately said, Don't do that. Answer me, I insisted. He sighed. You were enough for the right person. But Emily wanted a different life. I stared at the table. So love wasn't enough. For some people, it isn't, he said. I felt anger rising again. She could have told me. She could have been honest. Mark nodded. Yes, she should have. I clenched my fists. Instead, she waited until the last moment so I would be the one left standing alone. I know, he said quietly. I looked at him and asked, Do you think she ever loved me? Mark didn't answer right away. I think she did, he finally said. But I also think she loved the life she imagined more. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. That's a painful truth, I said. But it makes sense. Mark said, What are you going to do now? I let out a long breath. I don't know. Part of me wants to call her and ask why. Part of me never wants to see her again. Both are normal, he said. I nodded slowly. I keep thinking this is a bad dream, I admitted. I keep thinking I'll wake up and she'll be next to me, telling me everything is fine. Mark looked at me and said, But you know that's not going to happen. Yeah, I said quietly. I know. There was a long silence before I spoke again. You know what hurts the most? I asked. What? Mark replied. I wasn't just betrayed, I said. I was replaced. Mark didn't interrupt. I continued. It's like I was an old phone she traded in for a newer model. You're not an object, Mark said firmly. That's not how this works. I looked at him and said, That's exactly how it feels. He shook his head. One day, you'll see this differently. I finished my drink and stood up. Right now, I just see clearly for the first time, I said. And what do you see? He asked. I looked at him and said quietly, I see that I was building a future with someone who was already planning a different one. Mark stood up too and put a hand on my shoulder. What now? He asked again. I thought for a moment and said, now I learn how to live without her. He nodded. That's going to hurt. Yeah, I said. But staying would have hurt more. A week later, I saw the photo online. Emily was smiling beside Daniel. I whispered, so this is the better life. My chest hurt. I called Mark. He answered, you saw it, didn't you? I said, yeah. They look perfect. He sighed, pictures lie. I said, it still hurts. He said, don't go see it. I asked, see what? He replied, the venue. They moved everything there. I closed my eyes. That was supposed to be my wedding, I said. He answered quietly, I know. I hung up and grabbed my keys. When I arrived, I just sat in the car and stared at the building. This is a bad idea, I told myself. But I got out anyway. A worker was carrying flowers inside. I walked up and asked, wedding today? He smiled and said, yeah, big one. Rich guy spared no expense. I nodded slowly. I can see that. Another worker said, the groom is some businessman. Daniel, I think. I forced a small smile. Yeah, I said quietly. I know him. He laughed and said, must be nice to have that kind of money. I replied, yeah, must be nice. I walked inside before anyone could stop me. Everything looked different. New flowers. New colors. New lights. I whispered, this was supposed to be ours. A woman arranging decorations looked at me and asked, are you a guest? I shook my head. No. I'm just someone who used to matter here. She looked confused and said, I'm sorry. I forced a smile. Don't worry about it. I was just leaving. But I didn't leave. I kept walking slowly, looking at everything. I picked this place, I whispered to myself. I remember Emily saying she loved the windows. I heard a familiar voice behind me say, everything has to be perfect. I froze. It was Emily. My heart started pounding. Another voice answered, it will be. I already paid them extra. That had to be Daniel. I moved slightly so I could see them without being noticed. Emily said, thank you for doing all this. Daniel replied, I told you, I don't like doing things halfway. She smiled and said, I can see that. He adjusted his watch and said, I want people to remember this wedding. She said softly, they will. I felt my hands clench. That was supposed to be our wedding, I whispered. I watched them walk past me without seeing me. Emily looked beautiful, but her smile looked different. I whispered, are you really happy? But she couldn't hear me. Daniel said, you don't have to worry about anything anymore. She nodded and said, it still feels unreal. He replied, get used to it. This is your life now. Something about the way he said it made me uncomfortable. Emily asked, do you think people will like the decorations? He smiled slightly and said, people like whatever I pay for. She laughed softly, but I noticed she looked down for a moment. I whispered, you used to care about love, not money. I stepped back before they could see me. My chest felt tight. I shouldn't be here, I told myself. But I couldn't leave yet. I heard Emily say, I hope I made the right decision. Daniel replied, you did. Trust me. She nodded, but she didn't look fully convinced. I walked toward the stage area and touched one of the chairs. I was supposed to stand here, I said quietly. I was supposed to wait for you here. My voice felt heavy. I was supposed to be the man you walked toward. I heard footsteps again and quickly moved away. One of the staff members asked me, Sir, are you looking for someone? I shook my head and said, No. I was just remembering something. He smiled politely and said, Well, today is a happy day here. I nodded slowly. Yeah, a very happy day. As I walked toward the exit, I heard Emily's voice again. Do you ever think about the past? She asked. Daniel replied, The past doesn't matter. Only the future does. She said quietly, I guess you're right. I stopped walking when I heard that. I whispered to myself, so that's it? I'm just the past now. My chest hurt, but I kept walking. I didn't want to hear more. I didn't want to see more. As I reached the door, I said quietly, I hope he gives you everything you wanted, Emily. I stepped outside and took a deep breath. It's over, I told myself. It's really over. My phone rang. It was Mark. I answered and said, You were right. I shouldn't have come. He asked, Are you okay? I looked back at the building and said, No, but I will be. He stayed silent for a moment, then said, Did you see her? I replied, Yeah, I saw her. He asked, Was she happy? I thought for a moment and said, I don't know. She was smiling, but it didn't look the same. Mark said, Then maybe you didn't lose what you think you lost. I leaned against my car and said, No, I lost it. I just didn't realize it was already gone. He didn't reply right away. Then he said, What are you going to do now? I opened the car door and said, I'm going to disappear. He sounded surprised. Disappear? I nodded even though he couldn't see me. Yeah. I'm not going to stand here and watch them live the life that was supposed to be mine. Mark said quietly, Running away won't fix your heart. I sat in the driver's seat and said, I'm not running away. I'm walking away. He asked, What's the difference? I started the engine and said, Running means you're scared. Walking away means you finally understand your worth. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he said, Where will you go? I looked at the road ahead and said, Somewhere I can forget who I used to be. He replied, And who were you? I thought for a moment and said, I was a man who thought love was enough. And now? He asked. I took a deep breath and said, Now I'm a man who knows it isn't. Then I hung up the phone, drove away, and didn't look back. I stood in the middle of my apartment and said out loud, I'm done. My voice sounded calm, but my hands were shaking. I looked around and whispered, I can't stay here anymore. My phone started ringing again. Mark's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it and said, I'm sorry, Mark. Not tonight. I let it ring until it stopped. I opened my closet and pulled out a suitcase. What do I even take? I asked myself. I grabbed a few shirts and threw them inside. This isn't running away, I said quietly. This is me choosing myself for the first time. The phone rang again. I picked it up but didn't speak. Mark's voice came through. Where are you? I replied, Home. He asked, Are you okay? I looked around and said, No, I'm not, but I will be. He was quiet for a second, then said, Don't do anything stupid. I almost laughed. Leaving isn't stupid, I said. Sometimes leaving is the smartest thing you can do. He asked, So you're really going to disappear? I zipped my suitcase and said, Yeah. He sounded frustrated. You can't just erase your life. I replied, Watch me. He said, At least tell me where you're going. I picked up an old photo of me and Emily and stared at it. I don't know, I said. Somewhere she can't find me. Mark said, She's been calling me. I closed my eyes. I don't want to talk to her. She sounds desperate, he said. I replied, She wasn't desperate when she left me. Mark sighed. You're hurt. I get it. I said, No, Mark. I'm awake. That's different. He didn't reply immediately. Then he asked, Are you coming back? I looked around the apartment one more time. No, I said. I don't think I am. He said quietly, Then this is goodbye. I swallowed and said, No, not goodbye. Just, see you later. He said, You better call me when you get wherever you're going. I replied, Maybe. He laughed a little. You're really doing this? I said, Yeah, I really am. After I hung up, I picked up the photo again. We looked happy, I whispered. Were we lying to each other, or just to ourselves? I placed the photo face down on the table. It doesn't matter anymore, I said. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Emily. I stared at her name for a long time. "What do you want from me now?" I whispered. The phone kept ringing. Finally, I answered. I didn't say anything. I just listened. "Please talk to me," she said. Her voice sounded different. "Why?" I asked. "What's left to say?" She said, "I need to explain." I shook my head even though she couldn't see me. "You already did. You chose him." She said, "It's not that simple." I replied, "It is for me." She started crying. "I never wanted to hurt you." I closed my eyes and said, "But you did." She said, "Please don't disappear." I froze when I heard that. "Who said I'm disappearing?" I asked. She said softly, "I know you. When you get quiet like this, it means you're leaving." I didn't reply. She whispered, "Please don't go." I picked up my suitcase and walked to the door. "I have to," I said. She asked, "Why?" I opened the door and said, "Because if I stay, I'll keep hoping. And hope is killing me." She was crying hard now. "Can we meet one last time?" she asked. I stepped outside and locked the door behind me. "No," I said. "If I see you again, I won't be able to leave." She said my name softly, like she used to. For a second, I almost changed my mind. But then I remembered her standing next to Daniel, smiling in those photos. "I loved you," I said quietly. "I still do. But I love myself more than I did yesterday. And that's why I'm leaving." She kept crying and said, "Will I ever see you again?" I walked to my car and put the suitcase in the back. "No," I said gently. "I don't think you will." She whispered, "I'm sorry." I sat in the driver's seat and said, "I know. But sorry doesn't change the decision you made." She asked, "Where will you go?" I started the engine and said, "Somewhere I can breathe again." She said, "I never wanted to lose you." I replied, "You didn't lose me. You let me go." Then I ended the call before she could say anything else. I started driving without a plan. The city lights slowly disappeared behind me. I said to myself, "This is the last night of the old me." Hours passed, and I just kept driving. My phone kept buzzing, but I ignored it. "No more looking back," I said. Around sunrise, I stopped the car on the side of the road and stepped outside. The sky was turning orange. I took a deep breath and said, "I have nothing now." The words sounded scary, but also freeing. No wedding. No apartment. No plans. Just me. I looked at the sunrise and said, "I'm going to rebuild my life. And this time, I'm not building it around someone else." I stood there for a long time, then whispered one last sentence to the man I used to be. "I'm not coming back." "Why do you always stay late?" Sarah asked me one evening. I looked up from my desk and said, "Because I don't like going home to an empty apartment." She crossed her arms and leaned against the door. "That's an honest answer," she said. I shrugged. "You asked." She walked in and sat across from me. "You work like someone who's trying to forget something," she said. I replied, "Maybe I am." She studied my face for a moment and said, "You look like someone who lost everything." I smiled a little and said, "Maybe I did." She didn't smile back. "Then build something new," she said. "That's what people like us do." I asked, "People like us?" She nodded. "The ones who don't have anyone else to fix our lives for us." I leaned back in my chair and said, "I'm not used to starting over." She replied, "Nobody is. But you're doing it anyway." I looked at the papers on my desk and said, "I just don't want to feel useless again." She said, "Then don't be useless. Be better. Be smarter. Be stronger." I laughed quietly. "You make it sound easy." She shook her head. "It's not easy. It's necessary." A few days later, she called me into her office. "Sit down," she said. I sat and asked, "Am I in trouble?" She slid a file toward me and said, "No. I'm giving you a chance." I looked at the file and asked, "What is this?" She said, "A new project. A big one." I looked at her, surprised. Why are you giving this to me? She answered, because you're hungry. And hungry people work harder. I opened the file and said, I won't disappoint you. She replied, don't do it for me. Do it for yourself. I nodded slowly. I will. She looked at me carefully and said, you're not the same person you were when you first came here. I asked, is that a good thing? She said, yes. When you arrived, you looked like a man who was waiting for his life to end. Now you look like a man who's building a new one. That night, I stayed late again, working on the project. I said to myself, you have to make this work. My phone buzzed, and for a second, I thought it might be Emily. But it wasn't. It was just a work email. I put the phone down and said quietly, why do I still think about you? I shook my head and went back to work. The next morning, Sarah stopped by my desk and asked, did you sleep here? I smiled and said, almost. She put a coffee on my desk and said, don't kill yourself working. Burnout won't help you. I picked up the coffee and said, thank you. She sat down and asked, why are you really working this hard? I thought for a moment and said, because I need to prove something to myself. She nodded. Good reason. I asked her, can I ask you something personal? She said, depends on the question. I said, have you ever had someone walk out of your life and take your future with them? She looked at me for a few seconds, then said, yes. I was surprised. What did you do? I asked. She replied, I stopped making them the center of my life story. I stayed quiet, listening. She continued, you can't control who leaves, but you can control who you become after they leave. I repeated her words quietly. Who you become after they leave, I said. She nodded and stood up. Finish the project, she said. We'll talk again after that. Weeks passed, and I worked harder than I ever had before. One evening, I walked into her office and said, I finished it. She took the file, spent a long time reading it, then looked up at me and said, this is good. Really good. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. So I didn't fail. I asked. She shook her head. No, you didn't fail. I smiled for the first time in a long time and said, I feel like I can breathe again. She replied, that's what moving forward feels like. I sat down and said, you know, a few months ago, I thought my life was over. She leaned back in her chair and said, and now? I looked around the office, then back at her. Now I think it's just beginning. She smiled slightly and said, good. Then don't look back. I nodded and said, I'm not planning to. Then I paused and added, at least, I'm trying not to. She said, that's enough for now. Just keep moving. I stood up to leave, and she said one more thing. You didn't lose everything, she said. I turned around and asked, what do you mean? She replied, you just lost the life you thought you wanted. That's different. I walked out of her office thinking about that. Maybe she's right, I said to myself. Maybe I didn't lose everything. Maybe I just got a second chance to build something better. For the first time in a long time, I smiled and said quietly, I'm becoming someone new. My phone rang while I was making coffee. I looked at the screen and said, Mark? That's rare. I answered and said, hey, you still alive? He laughed a little and said, yeah, you're hard to reach these days. I leaned against the counter and said, I told you I was starting over. He replied, yeah, I can see that. You sound different. I said, different is good. He went quiet for a moment, then said, you need to hear this. I frowned and asked, hear what? He hesitated. It's about Emily. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then I said, I don't think I need updates about her life. He replied, just listen first. Then you can decide. I sighed and said, fine. I'm listening. He said, her life isn't the fairy tale you think it is. I walked to the window and said, I never said it was a fairy tale. I just assumed she got what she wanted. Mark replied, she got the money. I don't think she got the happiness. I stayed quiet. He continued, Daniel is not the guy she thought he was. I asked, what does that mean? Mark said, it means he's controlling. He decides where they go, who she talks to, what she wears. Everything. I frowned and said, Emily would never accept that. Mark replied, I thought so too, but I saw it myself. I sat down slowly and asked, you met them? He said, yeah, at a business event. She looked different. I asked, different how? He paused before answering, quieter, careful with her words, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. I didn't like the way that sounded. Maybe you're imagining things, I said. Mark replied, I'm not. I've known her for years. That wasn't the Emily we knew. I rubbed my forehead and said, that's not my problem anymore. Mark said, I know, but there's more. I closed my eyes and said, just say it. He took a breath and said, she asked about you. My chest felt tight for a moment, but I forced myself to stay calm. What did you tell her? I asked. He said, I told her you moved on. That you're doing well. I nodded slowly. Good, I said. That's all she needs to know. Mark said, she didn't look happy when I said that. I didn't reply. He continued, she asked if you were seeing someone. I let out a small breath and said, and what did you say? He replied, I said that's none of her business anymore. I smiled a little. Thanks. He said, she looked like she wanted to ask more, but Daniel came back and she stopped talking. I stood up and walked around the room. So that's her life now, I said. She has to stop talking when he walks into the room. Mark said quietly, yeah. I asked, why are you telling me this? He answered, because I thought you should know the truth. I said, the truth is she made her choice. Mark replied, yeah, she did. There was a long silence before he spoke again. You know what the strange part is? He asked. What? I replied. He said, when I mentioned your name, she didn't look angry. She didn't look annoyed. She looked sad. I leaned against the wall and crossed my arms. Sad doesn't change anything, I said. Mark replied, I know. I'm just telling you what I saw. I asked quietly, do you think she regrets it? Mark sighed. I don't know, but I know she doesn't look happy. I looked out the window and said, I used to think hearing that would make me happy. Mark asked, and does it? I thought for a moment and said, no, it just makes me feel distant. He didn't say anything, so I continued, it's like hearing a story about someone I used to know. Mark said, that means you're moving on. I nodded slowly. Yeah, I think I am. He asked, if she called you today, what would you do? I thought about it carefully and said, I don't know, but I know I wouldn't go back. He replied, that's a big change. I smiled slightly and said, yeah, a few months ago, I would have run to her. Now, I'd probably just listen and then hang up. Mark laughed softly. I'm proud of you. I shook my head and said, don't be proud. Just be there if I ever forget this feeling. He said, you won't forget. I replied, I might. Love makes people stupid. He said, you're not stupid anymore. I smiled a little and said, no, I'm not. He was quiet for a moment, then he said one last thing. When I saw her, I realized something. I asked, what? He said, you didn't lose her. She lost you. I didn't respond right away. I just looked out the window and thought about everything that had happened. After a long silence, I said quietly, maybe we both lost something. Mark asked, what do you mean? I replied, she lost someone who loved her, and I lost someone who didn't love me enough. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he said, yeah, that sounds about right. I ended the call and put the phone down. I stood there for a long time and whispered to myself, I don't belong in her world anymore. And for the first time, that truth didn't hurt. It felt like closure. I was in my office reviewing a report when my assistant knocked and said, there's someone here to see you. I didn't look up and said, "Tell them to make an appointment." She hesitated, then said quietly, "She said you know her." Something in her tone made me look up. "What's her name?" I asked. She hesitated again. "Emily," she said. My heart skipped once, hard and sudden. I leaned back in my chair and said, "Send her in." When the door opened and I saw her, I felt time collapse in on itself. She looked the same, but also different. Softer. Tired. Careful. She closed the door behind her and said, "Hi." I didn't stand up. I just said, "You found me." She nodded slowly. "I've been looking for you." I folded my hands on the desk and said, "Why?" She swallowed and said, "Because I needed to talk to you." I replied, "You had something to say a long time ago." She looked down and whispered, "I know." There was a long silence before I said, "You should sit down." She sat across from me and said, "You look different." I replied, "I am different." She nodded like she expected that. "I'm glad you're doing well," she said. I looked at her and asked, "Why are you here, Emily?" She took a deep breath and said, "I made a mistake." I didn't react. I just asked, "Is that what you came here to say?" She nodded, and her eyes filled with tears. "I thought I was choosing the right life," she said. "I thought I was being smart." I said calmly, "So now I'm the mistake." She shook her head quickly. "No. Leaving you was the mistake." I leaned back and said, "You were very sure when you left." She whispered, "I was wrong." I looked at her for a long moment and said, "Do you know what the worst part was?" She shook her head slowly. I said, "You didn't even fight for us. You just let go." She started crying quietly. "I was scared," she said. "Of what?" I asked. "Of a small life. Of struggling. Of not becoming someone important," she said. I nodded slowly. "So you traded love for status." She closed her eyes and said, "When you say it like that, it sounds horrible." I replied, "That's because it was." She wiped her tears and said, "He's not who I thought he was." I didn't respond. She continued, "He controls everything. My schedule, my friends, my choices. I feel like I'm living someone else's life." I said quietly, "But it's the life you chose." She nodded, crying again. "I know. And I have to live with that." She looked at me and said, "But I never stopped thinking about you." I didn't move. I just asked, "Thinking about me, or regretting your decision?" She whispered, "Both." I leaned forward slightly and said, "Do you know what I learned after you left?" She looked at me and shook her head. I said, "I learned that the person who loves you shouldn't be the one you have to compete with the world for." She covered her mouth and cried. "I'm so sorry," she said. I replied, "I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying this because it's the truth." She reached across the desk and tried to hold my hand. "Please," she said. I gently pulled my hand back. "No," I said quietly. "You don't get to hold my hand anymore." She froze when I said that. "I deserve that," she whispered. I nodded slightly. "Yeah, you did." She looked at me and said, "I was selfish. I see that now." I replied, "Yes, you were. But I was also blind. So we both made mistakes." She asked softly, "Do you hate me?" I thought about it and said, "No, I don't hate you." She looked surprised. "I did for a while," I continued. "But not anymore." She asked, "Why not?" I answered, "Because hating you would mean you still control my emotions. And you don't." She cried again but tried to smile. "You really changed," she said. I nodded. "I had to. The old me wouldn't have survived what you did." She whispered, "I miss you." I looked at her calmly and said, "You miss the person who loved you unconditionally. That's different from missing me." She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly. "I deserve that too," she said. I said, "I'm not trying to punish you. Life already did that." She looked down and said, "I thought money would make everything easier." I replied, "Money makes things comfortable, not meaningful." She looked back at me and asked the question I knew was coming. Is there any chance for us again? The room felt very quiet after she said that. I looked at her for a long time before answering. Then I said gently, no. She closed her eyes when she heard that, but she nodded. I understand, she whispered. I said, I needed you when it mattered. And you weren't there. A tear rolled down her face. I know, she said. And I will regret that for the rest of my life. I stood up and walked to the window, then said, I hope one day you find happiness, Emily. I really do. She stood up behind me and asked, and you? Are you happy? I thought for a moment and said, I'm at peace. And that's enough for me. She said my name one last time, softly, like a memory. I didn't turn around. After a moment, I heard the door open, then close again. I stood there for a long time and whispered to myself, this time, I didn't break. She didn't leave that day. When I turned from the window, she was still standing there. I frowned and said, I thought you left. She shook her head and said, there's more you need to know. I didn't sit down. I just said, say it, then. She took a deep breath and said, my marriage is over. I looked at her quietly but didn't react. She continued, Daniel is seeing someone else. I crossed my arms and asked, and you're surprised? She flinched a little and said, no. I guess I deserve that. I replied, I didn't say that. She looked at me and said, you didn't have to. She sat down again and said, I thought I was choosing security, but I was just choosing a different kind of loneliness. I stayed silent, so she continued talking. He's never home. And when he is, we barely talk. Everything became about appearances. Parties. Photos. Business deals. I felt like an accessory, not a partner. I said calmly, you chose that life. She nodded. I know. I'm not blaming him. I'm blaming myself. I walked back to my desk and sat down. So why are you telling me this? I asked. She looked straight at me and said, because I lost everything. I repeated her words slowly. Everything. She nodded, tears forming again. I lost the person who loved me. I lost the life I could have had. And now I'm losing the life I chose too. I leaned back in my chair and said quietly, that's not losing everything. That's facing consequences. She closed her eyes when I said that. You're right, she whispered. This is karma. I shook my head slightly. No. Karma would be me ruining your life. I didn't do that. You did. She started crying again but didn't argue. After a long silence, she said, do you remember when you told me love was about choosing the same person every day? I nodded slowly. Yeah. I remember. She looked at me and said, I didn't choose you. And now I have to live with that. I didn't respond. She wiped her tears and asked the question I knew was coming. Can we try again? She asked softly. The room felt very still after she said that. I looked at her for a long time before answering. Why? I asked. She looked confused. What do you mean why? I said, why do you want me now? Is it because you love me? Or because he doesn't? She opened her mouth but didn't answer immediately. That silence gave me the answer. I see, I said quietly. She shook her head quickly. No, it's not like that. I realized too late what I lost. I replied, yes, too late. She started crying harder. People make mistakes, she said. I nodded. Yes, they do. And then they live with the consequences. She looked at me and said, I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to give me another chance. I took a deep breath and said the hardest thing I had to say. No, she froze when she heard that. No, she repeated. I nodded slowly. I already lost you once, I said. I won't lose myself again. Tears rolled down her face, and she said, I'm not the same person anymore. I replied, neither am I. That's why this can't work. She covered her face with her hands and cried. I don't have anyone, she said. I felt a sharp pain in my chest when I heard that, but I didn't move. You have yourself, I said quietly. That has to be enough now. She looked up at me and said, "You were always enough for me. I was just too blind to see it." I shook my head. "No. I was enough. You just wanted more." She didn't argue with that. She asked me one more question. "Do you still love me?" I was quiet for a long time before answering. "A part of me probably always will," I said honestly. "But that doesn't mean we belong together." She cried silently, and I let her. I didn't walk over. I didn't try to comfort her. This time, it wasn't my job to fix her pain. I had learned that lesson the hard way. After a while, she stood up slowly and said, "I guess this is goodbye." I nodded and said, "Yeah, this is goodbye." She looked at me like she wanted to say something else, but she didn't. She just nodded and walked to the door. Before she opened it, she turned back and said, "I really did love you, you know." I looked at her and said, "I know. But love without respect isn't love. It's just attachment." She closed her eyes when I said that. Then she opened the door and walked out. This time, she didn't come back. I sat in my chair for a long time after she left. I looked around my office and said quietly, "This is my life now." It felt strange, but it also felt right. I whispered one last sentence to the empty room. Karma doesn't knock twice. It just waits. I sat in my office for a long time after she left. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I just felt quiet inside, like a storm had finally ended. I leaned back in my chair and whispered, "It's over." Saying those words out loud felt strange, but also right. For years, a part of me had been stuck in the past, waiting for answers, waiting for explanations, waiting for something that would make everything make sense. But now I understood something simple. Closure doesn't come from other people. It comes from the moment I decide to stop looking back. Later that evening, Sarah knocked on my open office door and said, "You're still here." I looked up and smiled a little. "Yeah," I said. "Just thinking." She walked in and sat across from me. "Mark told me Emily came to see you," she said carefully. I nodded once. She did. Sarah watched my face and asked, "You okay?" I smiled again, but this time it felt real. "Yeah," I said. "I finally am." She studied me for a moment and said, "That means the conversation went the way it needed to go." I nodded. "She wanted to come back," I said. Sarah didn't look surprised. "And?" she asked. And I said no, I replied. Sarah let out a slow breath and said, "That must have been hard." I thought about it for a moment before answering. "Yeah," I said. "But losing myself again would have been harder." Sarah nodded slowly. "I'm proud of you," she said. I shook my head a little and said, "I'm not proud. I'm just different now." She smiled gently and said, "Different is good." I looked around my office and said, "Everything I have now, I built it after she left. Every late night, every risk, every failure. This life didn't come from luck. It came from pain." Sarah said quietly, "Pain changes people." I nodded. "Yeah, it does. It either breaks you or builds you. I guess I got tired of being broken." She smiled a little and said, "You know, when I first met you, you never talked about the past. But I could see it in the way you worked, the way you never trusted easy things, the way you always expected people to leave." I looked at her and asked, "And now?" She smiled. "Now you look like someone who knows he'll be fine, no matter who stays or who leaves." I leaned back in my chair and said, "Emily was the center of my life once. Everything I did, I imagined a future with her in it. And when she left, it felt like my whole future disappeared." Sarah listened quietly as I continued. But I was wrong. My future didn't disappear. It just changed. And honestly, I think this future suits me better. Sarah crossed her arms and said, "So what do you want now?" I thought about that question carefully. "Peace," I said. "Respect. A life that feels honest. I don't need a perfect life. I just need a real one." She smiled and said, "That's a good answer." I smiled back and said, "For the first time in years, I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone. I'm just living my life." She stood up and walked toward the door, then stopped and said, "You know, You're not the same man who got his heart broken. I nodded. No. That man thought love was enough. Sarah asked softly, and what do you think now? I answered, now I think love without respect, loyalty, and trust is just a beautiful way to destroy yourself. She smiled a little and said, that sounds like wisdom. I laughed quietly and said, no. That sounds like experience. She laughed too, then said, well, I'm glad you're okay. I looked at her and said, I am. And Sarah? She turned around. Yeah. I said, thank you for staying. When everyone else was walking away from me, you stayed. I don't forget things like that. She looked a little surprised, then smiled warmly. You don't have to thank me, she said. I stayed because I wanted to, not because you needed me to. I nodded slowly. That's why it matters, I said. After she left, I sat alone again, but this time the silence felt different. It didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. I looked around my office, at the city lights outside the window, at the life I had built with my own hands, and I said quietly, this is my life. And I chose it. I thought about the past one last time, not with pain, but with understanding. She didn't ruin my life, I whispered to myself. She redirected it. And in a strange way, I was grateful for that, because the man I am now is stronger than the man I was then. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and turned off the office lights. As I walked out, I said one last thing to the empty room. I'm not the man who was left behind anymore. I'm the man who kept moving forward. When I stepped outside, the night air felt cool and calm. I took a deep breath and smiled to myself. For the first time in years, I said quietly, I feel free. Sometimes, I catch myself staring at my phone, half expecting a message, a call, anything from her. Then I remember, she's gone, and she has been for a long time. I used to hate that. I used to imagine shouting at her, asking why, replaying every word of that call in my mind like it held the answer to my life. Now, I don't hate her anymore. Not really. I just understand. I whispered to myself, it's okay. It had to happen. And it did. Because losing her forced me to see who I really am. I'm not the same man who waited, trembling, hoping for a ring, hoping she would choose me. I'm someone who walks away when love is a lie. I lean back in my chair and say out loud, even though the office is empty, I survived. I became someone else. The phone buzzed with a new notification, and I ignored it. Not because I don't care about my life, but because I've learned what matters now. My focus is on what I can control, my work, my choices, my growth. Sarah once said, you can't change the past, but you can shape yourself. I nod to the memory, thinking, she was right. I walk to the window and rest my hands on the glass. The city sprawls below me, lights flickering like small promises. I remember the day Emily called. I remember the numbness, the disbelief, the way my chest felt hollow, as if someone had pulled the air out of my lungs. I remember asking, what about us? And she said, I'm sorry. I remember that exact moment, the one that broke me, and I realize now it didn't break me. It remade me. I mutter softly, I made it. Not because I won against her, not because I proved anything to anyone. I made it because I chose myself when I had every reason not to. I made it because I survived the betrayal, the heartbreak, and the loneliness, and I didn't just survive, I grew. That is victory. That is enough. A knock interrupts my thoughts. Sarah steps in, her arms crossed, a slight smirk on her face. You're still staring out that window, she says. I laugh quietly. Some habits die hard. She walks closer and says, you look different. I raise an eyebrow. Different how? She shrugs. Calmer. Stronger. Less haunted. I nod slowly. Yeah. I've learned to let go of ghosts that weren't mine to carry. She sits on the edge of my desk and says, so, the man who used to be left behind, he's gone. I smile faintly. He's not gone. He's just better equipped. He knows the difference between love and obsession, between loyalty and convenience. Sarah tilts her head. And how does that feel? I take a deep breath, feeling the weight of years lift slightly. Liberating. I think about Emily again. I remember her face, her voice, the way she said Daniel's name without hesitation. And I admit, a part of me still aches. But it's different now. It's not the ache of wanting her. It's the ache of having loved deeply and lost. A better ache, one that reminds me I'm alive, that I can feel, and that I can still care without being consumed. Sarah leans back, studying me. You're smiling differently, she says. It's true, I reply. This isn't a fake smile. It's mine. She laughs softly, and I realize I haven't laughed like this in years. Not really. You survived, she says. You did more than survive. You changed. I nod. Yes. And that's the point. Survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about learning to live. I turn back to the window. The city hums below me, indifferent, yet full of possibilities. I whisper again, I made it. I made me. It's not arrogance. It's acknowledgement. Every choice, every heartbreak, every sleepless night brought me here. Every moment that felt like an end was actually a beginning. And I see that clearly now. A breeze slides through the open window, and I close my eyes for a moment. I feel calm. I feel strong. I feel complete. I am not defined by the past anymore. I am defined by the man I chose to become. Sarah taps my shoulder gently. What now? She asks. I smile, turning fully to face her. Now, I say, I live. I focus on the life I want, the man I am, and the people who stay. Nothing more, nothing less. She smiles back knowingly. Sounds like freedom. I nod. It is. And it's mine. I glance back at the city lights, thinking of all the roads I've walked, the choices I've made, the pain I've survived. I whisper one last time, a statement to myself, to the empty office, to the man I've become. I walked through fire, I kept my soul, and I chose me. That is enough. Sarah smiles softly and says, You've earned it. I nod, feeling the truth of her words settle into me. I am finally free, not because someone left me, not because someone came back, but because I found myself. And for the first time in my life, I know I will never lose me again. I take a deep breath, look out at the endless city, and smile. This is the life I choose, the man I became. And that is victory.